Greater Than 0% is a 501c3 nonprofit that's on a mission to share stories of organizations from around the world that are changing lives. We have weekly episodes featuring amazing nonprofits and monthly episodes interviewing top business executives. You can find us at gtzp.org on your preferred streaming or social media platforms.
Hey, thanks everybody for tuning into this episode. Today we have Sarah Katie, who's the CEO of React DC. Sarah, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me. I'm super excited to be here.
All right. So per usual, we like to get started by hearing what the mission is of the organizations we're interviewing. So what is the mission of React DC?
Sure. React DC was founded in August of 2021 after the collapse of Afghanistan. It was women founded by professional military spouses and veterans. And our mission is to empower and enable newcomers and refugees to the United States to thrive and become self-sufficient.
All right. We'll get into the details of that and the activities you're doing. But before we do, why you? Why is this a passion project and something you're dedicating your time to?
Absolutely. So I've been involved in refugee resettlement for over 20 years, and I fell into it professionally after college. I thought I was going to do Teach for America, and I ended up graduating a semester early and was placed at a small elementary school in Syracuse, New York, that was serving a large number of refugees at that time from Bosnia, Sudan, and Somalia. And I decided that my life's work was going to be working with refugees. And I remember when I was in high school, the genocide in Rwanda was happening. And I was, living in a small town in New York, and my parents got the newspaper, and the images of the Rwandan refugees with all of their possessions fleeing into Congo is something that stuck with me. And I remember thinking, in a safe house, warm food on the table, no security issues, looking at those images and feeling like, based on what your religion was or your ethnicity, or the language that you spoke, being forced to flee everything that you felt brought you safety and security was just unimaginable. So when I was placed at that school in Syracuse and realized that I could make a difference in the lives of refugees resettling to the United States, decided not to do Teach for America and did AmeriCorps Vista in Baltimore, organizing a youth program for refugees. And really, the rest is history. So I've done case management, I've done job development, I've organized youth programs, and I've worked at the headquarters for 2 large resettlement agencies. And then most recently, after the collapse of Afghanistan, I was deployed to Northern Virginia, who has a large existing Afghan population, and have been able to oversee 2 large-scale resettlement agencies, one with Lutheran Social Services and one with Lutheran Immigration Refugee Services, that welcomed thousands of our Afghan allies. And I had been working as a partner with React DC and realized that they were deeply embedded in the community, their grassroots. And we believe in really providing strength-based, client-centered services. And I think what sets React out from other nonprofits is that we really believe that the clients come first. We want to hear from what their needs are. And all of our staff is deeply empathetic. Many of my staff are Afghan evacuees themselves. And so they have the firsthand experience of being a refugee and have now become refugee service providers and are just fabulous, deeply empathetic human beings.
Yeah. Wow. That's an amazing story. And it's so awesome how you just made that pivot. Like your plan was one direction, like doing the Teach for America, right? And then all of a sudden, newspaper, complete pivot. That's amazing.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Wow. Probably the main question that you hear a lot is your opinion on the role that the U.S. should have in these global conflicts and like Rwanda, for example, wars and conflicts that we have. How is your perception of the role the United States should play in that field, and how has that kind of evolved over time from your experience?
Sure. So the U.S. refugee program started in 1980 after the collapse of Vietnam. So the U.S. has a long history it's a bipartisan supported program of welcoming refugees. Yep. However, only 1% of the world's refugees are resettled to a third country. So it is not enough. And now there's millions and millions of refugees who will not get what's called a durable solution. So ideally, after a conflict ends, people would be able to go home, but that's oftentimes not the case. And then the second, what's called durable solution, is people are integrated into a second country. And then third is resettlement. The U.S. has an obligation to bring many refugees to the U.S., as far as I'm concerned, on a humanitarian basis. And as I mentioned, large, long-term bipartisan support. Under the Trump administration, unfortunately, it was drastically reduced, but we are now in the process of rebuilding the resettlement infrastructure. And this coming year, the US has agreed to take 125,000 refugees. So agencies like React DC provide support to those resettlement agencies that had oftentimes been under-resourced and understaffed. And so it takes a large network of partner agencies and private citizens to support the refugees that are coming. But I absolutely believe that the United States should lead in refugee resettlement. Yeah. We do in terms of numbers, but I believe that we can welcome far more than we do.
Yeah. And this is going to be hard to do, but putting yourselves in the shoes of what the situation was during the Trump administration, of pulling back from refugee resettlement, which it sounds like that was the case. Like, do you remember how many per year the U.S. committed under?
God, I want to say that the presidential determination might have only been like 50,000, but they welcomed even far less than that. And so last year, the presidential determination was high as well, and they did not still meet that need because the infrastructure had been decimated. There's been a lot of resources and a lot of innovative practices to rebuild the refugee program. There's now something called the Welcome Corps, which is the private citizens are going to be able to sponsor refugees overseas, which will supplement the traditional State Department funded resettlement program. So I think the U.S. is looking at innovative ways to increase the numbers, but we're just not where we need to be yet. I mean, ideally, there would be no need for refugee resettlement anywhere. But as you can see about the state of the world currently, that's just not where we're headed.
Yeah. What are the main reasons do you think the previous administration did not want refugees? So, like, what is their argument?
I mean, anti-immigrant sentiment, racism, a very narrow worldview. It was really the only administration in modern history that had restricted it in such a way. I mean, the Muslim ban. So that, having been in refugee resettlement, a social worker, somebody who really values the benefits, the contributions that refugees had, it was a very difficult time. And refugees were separated. They had filed for family members that were languishing in refugee camps because of the numbers, the diminished numbers and the diminished capacity. So it was honestly one of the most, I think, devastating policy decisions the United States could have ever made.
Yeah. You mentioned something in there, the benefits and contributions of refugees. Like, I think that is something that probably isn't spoken about enough. And it is like one of the best counter arguments to that plan. So I'd love to hear your opinion on, and your perspective and experience with, like, what are the benefits and contributions of refugees in our country?
Sure. I mean, obviously, refugees come to work, right? So most of the refugee population goes to work immediately. They bring tons of benefit to the U.S. economy. And I think during the pandemic, we saw that the U.S. workforce was decimated. And so refugees come and they bring an amazing skill set. They bring the desire to work. I mean, they want to be self-sufficient in the United States. And then one of the prime examples I want to talk about is our Afghan allies. I mean, these are highly trained professional interpreters, military people, interpreters that bring an amazing skill set to the United States. I mean, I was referencing my staff. We have a legal team. I just hired a legal specialist to serve as a paralegal who is an Afghan attorney. I mean, it is an untapped resource. And then from a human perspective, I mean, we always label people refugees, right? Any one of us could be a refugee. You are a human being. And so you bring, your entire life experience, you bring your family, you bring your cultural traditions. And so it's an invaluable program. And again, just from a personal experience, working with refugees for 20 years has deeply impacted my worldview and my life. And the U.S. is so much better for this program.
Yeah. Wow. Broader worldview. This is kind of another interesting concept, and it's kind of, I've learned it's hard to force it on everyone, right? Like to have a broader worldview. But what are some of the things that you've seen kind of open people's mind that maybe have not been exposed to a newspaper with the pictures from Rwanda? Like, what have you seen of like people that
Sure.
you've talked to get engaged with your organization or other organizations that really expand their view on the world and kind of the responsibility that a country like us has to it?
Sure. I think it's talking about the refugee program. I mean, when I first started, now again, 20 years ago, we were told to really not talk about the number of refugees that come to the United States because it was a controversial program, right?
Mm.
People are oftentimes scared about the unknown. They're scared about other religions. They're scared about people that look different. And so in recent years, I think raising awareness about the contributions that refugees bring, that these are human beings, that you could have a refugee family living next to you, and that when you hear their story, their trauma, and then understand that they're just human beings who want their kids to succeed, they don't want to be afraid of being killed every time they leave their house, humanizing it in that way. And I do think that this private sponsorship program, which we have now already for Ukrainians, Venezuelans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and now we're trying to expand it through the Welcome Corps, to get private citizens to say, okay, these are human beings. You're going to welcome them into your lives. Their kids are going to thrive in school. They're going to contribute to the economy. They're going to bring their skill set from overseas. It's really just about, I think, breaking down myths and stereotypes.
Yeah.
And humanizing refugees.
Yeah. And I think that makes sense. Like that's an easy way to use information and data of the refugees, people that are now contributing to society. I think what the kind of the other side of the arguments, main argument is that they're not going to be contributing to society. But even then, like if people are fleeing war-torn areas and mass murders, like right, or just like terrible access to resources, like even if they're not going to be contributing to society, at least initially, like what is our responsibility as a country to those people? And a lot of times people are like, well, we have homeless population here in the US, so why not focus on that population before expanding globally? But we're just a very large country with a lot of resources.
Agreed. I think you could do both. And then again, like I've had conversations, I have some very conservative members of my family. And then when you actually start talking about it, it's like, oh, I didn't know that, or I didn't realize, or I didn't know that, most refugees go to work within 90 days of arrival to the US, and the kids are going to learn English in 3 to 4 months. This Madeleine Albright, refugee, right? Founder of Chobani, refugee. Founder of Google, refugee. It's like, oh, like people didn't realize all of that. And so I think you just kind of have to bring that back to the forefront. Right?
Yeah. And it does stink though that they have to have the contribution to society in order for it to like check the box of like, okay, I'm okay now with it happening. It's just like, really?
I mean, not for me, right?
And
not for like staff at React. Like we get the bigger human perspective, but I mean, not everyone's there yet, and I'm hoping that we can raise awareness and come and volunteer with us, right? Like if you're fearful about that we're bringing Afghans to the US, like come and work with my team and my staff, and on that level, that's what we want to see.
And then share your opinion and perspective on it.
Correct. Yes.
Awesome. All right. Sorry, tangent. So React DC programming, how is the programming developed over kind of the lifetime of React DC to this
Sure.
date?
So we're definitely expanding. We're in an expansion phase. It was founded, as I mentioned, in September 2021, with just a couple of staff that were really doing home setups for the large arrivals to the DMV, the DC metro area. So as I mentioned before, Northern Virginia has a huge existing Afghan population. And so when Afghanistan collapsed, many people arrived to Dulles Airport and were joining friends and family and colleagues in this area. And so React DC really stepped up to provide initial sort of basic needs support and home furnishings for people arriving. We've since evolved, and we still do basic needs support, but our largest program right now is a legal clinic that's staffed by 2 immigration attorneys, and then all Afghan staff that are trilingual, and many of them are Afghan evacuees themselves. It's an amazing model because they have the cultural awareness and the linguistic capability, and many of the evacuees arrive with something called humanitarian parole status, which, while it was the safest, fastest way to evacuate staff, it's deeply problematic as an immigration status because it does not afford you a path to citizenship or permanent residency.
Mm.
So we opened this clinic in February of this year, just doing asylum, which is a tedious, difficult process. We're not happy about that our Afghan allies have to go through that because of the red tape, the length of the application, and then they have to retell their trauma story, which is quite difficult. Again, really grateful that we have this competent staff that understands the country conditions. They understand that the Taliban is a terrorist organization. They understand the bombings that have happened, all of that. But the good news is that we also just secured a contract to provide continued legal services, and we're expanding to do work permits. We're doing family reunification, and we'll be helping people adjust status while we continue to provide asylum. We have a women's empowerment program, which currently is unfunded, but we have a really strong following of women. And the whole goal is to reduce isolation, help them integrate into society. So we have women's events that bring people together. We had one recently that focused on resume and interview skills. And then we had a job fair focused on the women where 17 people were hired. So we're super excited about that. And we have an employment program. I have 2 employment staff that help overseas professionals get hopefully back into their career in Afghanistan. But we also help them get entry-level jobs with the goal of then them moving up. And we have what's called a private co-sponsorship program. And so we provide technical assistance and training to private citizens that are welcoming people from Ukraine, Venezuela, Nicaragua. So yeah, we're definitely growing and expanding, but trying to maintain our grassroots client-centered outlook with the clients.
Yeah. I'd love to hear some stories of individuals that have come through your programming and the impact it's had on them, if any come top of mind in the history.
Sure. I mean, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, again, I think that something that makes us unique is that we have many of our staff are former evacuees.
Yeah.
And so some of our legal specialists, the person that I was just referencing, is an Afghan attorney that is now working for us. And my employment director is also a prior beneficiary of React DC. So, assistance with sort of getting on their feet, and now they're in a really professionalized job and are able to give back to the community. So again, really something that we're deeply proud of is that we're hiring from within our beneficiary community, and then helping other clients, but then also giving them that professional development. And then, in Northern Virginia, when a rent is $2,500, getting a second job and getting a woman who might have traditionally never worked out into that workforce is something that's really impactful and life-changing. It's really the difference from living paycheck to paycheck and potentially being at risk for eviction. So it was our first little in-house job fair. My team did amazing. And I mean, 17 people hired in like a 4-hour event is pretty phenomenal. So we were super proud about that.
Wow. Future plans.
Yeah.
What do you hope React DC looks like in the near and longer future?
Yeah, I mean, we want to just continue to expand our services. I think what we would like to see our legal clinic sustained for years, because it's a process. So once you get asylum, which now we've had several clients get asylum, they would be eligible to file family reunification paperwork, and then obviously we would want them to move towards getting the lawful permanent residence, or what's traditionally known as the green card. Yep. We would love to actually become a State Department resettlement site. There's still an ongoing need. The U.S. is going to welcome thousands more Afghans this coming year, and many of them will come to Northern Virginia. So we would like to be able to provide those upfront services. And then I think we really would like to start looking at mental health, particularly the mental health of our women who are isolated. They have larger families. Many of them are pre-literate. And so to really put some resources and time and effort into our women's empowerment program with some more structured curriculum, support groups, resources for mental health, resources for domestic violence, parenting. And so sort of looking at, whereas the whole United States was really at the forefront of a large-scale humanitarian crisis in 2021, while Afghans continue to come, we need to start addressing sort of the longer term integration, and mental health and women's empowerment and long-term employment are at the forefronts of those.
Okay. This is kind of a basic 101 question, but it's education that I think is important. Asylum. What is the process like of getting asylum, and what are like some of the boxes that one has to check in order to apply for it?
Sure, it's extremely burdensome, and so there's a large backlog of applications from everyone around the world. So traditionally, when you come to the United States, you have 1 year to apply, and then it is a huge after arrival. It is a huge application process. It generally needs to have an attorney doing it because it's so difficult. High rates of denials. The process is a bit different for Afghans, and they were sort of expediting their application processes, obviously because we know about the country conditions in Afghanistan and the Taliban. However, it still takes, hours and hours and hours for clients to fill out that application, and you need to submit a lot of documentation. And in a country like Afghanistan, many people don't have birth certificates, right? Many dates are different. It's not as important. Many people don't have a marriage certificate. They might not know when their kids were born. And so putting the Western standards of documentation and proof of when people were born and married and, the dates your kids were born, compiling all of that is extremely tedious. And then it all needs to be translated. So you'll have, if you have a record of birth, which is rare, or a country card, identity called a Tazkara, my staff has to literally translate it, submit the application. You have to type up, and this is where it's difficult and traumatic for clients, your persecution story, right? So high levels of details of if you were threatened or tortured or your family was killed, or why you fear going back to Afghanistan. And so it can be very, very difficult on clients. And that's just the application, right? And then you send it to USCIS, they review it, and then you're called in for an interview. And so my staff and my attorneys are spending hours upon hours at the asylum office, in front of asylum officers, line by line. Okay, you said your child was born on such and such a date. You were married on this such and such a date. Why are you afraid to go back to Afghanistan? Did the Taliban kidnap your mother or your sister? And they're long interviews. And so it is deeply unfortunate that the U.S. has failed to pass the Afghan Adjustment Act, which would have allowed all of our Afghan allies to bypass the asylum process and become lawful permanent residents. We continue to do advocacy around it, but I'm not sure it's going to pass. But that's a way for people to get involved, is to raise their voice about the Afghan Adjustment Act. So again, the people that stood by our troops, by our NGOs for 20 years are not subject to this really tedious and frankly traumatic process.
Yeah. Wow. You said initially when they come to the country, would they have to have received approvals at that initial stage when
Absolutely.
they arrived?
So they were, everyone was vetted overseas, security clearance overseas. And then in the fall of 2021, many of them were transported to military bases where they did medical screenings, more vetting. They applied for work permits. But everybody was vetted before they arrived.
Okay. Wow. That just seems like a very long and tedious process. And that's just for this example is just for the Afghan refugees and people seeking asylum as well, right?
Yeah. I mean, so the asylum process is very similar for all people. And so, for instance, if you're seeking asylum, you're from Cameroon, you oftentimes enter the United States and on like a work visa or a student visa, you overstay that visa. But you should do it, you should apply within a year. And then the burden of proof is on you. And then there's oftentimes people that are detained. That are, we're detaining people that are trying to seek, safety from persecution. So it's,
getting persecuted after. Gotcha. Jeez, that's brutal. Okay. Wow. Well, that's amazing that you guys are supporting that process. It seems, I can't imagine the overwhelm for somebody seeking asylum and having to recount their traumas, and kind of justify why.
But our team tells us, we have a group chat every time someone gets an asylum grant, and it's like a little miniature party in here, because it is a huge deal. And while it affords them, not to to have to leave the United States, they still have to go through the green card process. They still have to go through the naturalization process. It is just the very beginning.
Jeez. What are some of the main reasons why people would get denied? Is it just not having the right documentation?
Yeah,
or
I
their
mean,
story? Is
again,
it like,
everyone is
yeah,
fairly well aware of the Taliban, and so
yeah,
we anticipate that most people will get approval because they're just so well known. But from other countries, it's hard to prove, like, the burden of proofs of persecution and credibility.
yeah,
And so people really need a strong attorney. I have a colleague who's a clinical, she's a counselor who's doing like psychosocial assessments to explain the, the persecution, the trauma that you faced in your home country
yeah.
is now causing you these mental health concerns. And then again, recounting that, like, many of these people, if they go back, they will be killed. Right.
Yeah. Wow. All right. Engagement. So our listeners that are really inspired by the amazing work that React DC is doing, and they want to get engaged, what type of engagement are you looking for, and where could they go to get in touch?
Sure. Absolutely. Go to our website, which is reactdc.org. It explains all of our programs. So we are always looking for volunteers. If you're local, certainly for volunteers to transport people, teach English, resume development. You could be partnered with a woman who doesn't really leave the house. You could teach her how to ride the bus. If you are not local to this area, we are always looking for private sponsor groups to welcome other people from Ukraine. We just had an arrival from Venezuela, so that information is on our group as well. We are looking for additional pro bono support. So if you are an attorney or a law firm and are interested in helping, our attorneys are fabulous and completely overwhelmed because they're at the asylum office all day. And then obviously we're looking for financial support, particularly to fund our women's program, because we need material goods. Diapers are not covered with food stamps, and Afghan families are generally very large. So something like providing, $25 to help families with diapers, ESL classes, Metro passes. We want a lot of the women to get certified in like IT, get them back into the American workforce. So lots of really strong ways to get engaged. And then in terms of advocacy, advocating for the passage of the Afghan Adjustment Act, and then really just raising awareness about refugee resettlement in the United States and the benefits and the humanitarian imperative to help people that are fleeing really traumatic situations.
Yeah. Wow. Well, thank you for sharing all of this. And so people that are listening, get engaged. We'll share all the links as well in the show notes and in our social media tagging. But Sarah, is there anything you want to leave us with, either that we didn't cover or any wise words you want to share before we wrap up the episode?
Again, I would just encourage everyone to learn more. I mean, from the time I was 14, it was something that was very important to me. And again, my life has been so enriched and drastically altered by working with refugees. And I would encourage, you don't need to give your career to it, but if you could volunteer a few hours, just talk about it, look into being a private sponsor. I think it would really be life altering for the people that are listening.
Wow. Well, Sarah, thanks again so much. We really appreciate your time, and we're honored to share the work that you are doing with React DC. And people that are listening, get engaged and learn. And thank you all for listening. And Sarah, again, until next time.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Thanks for listening to Greater Than 0%. To find more episodes or to have your organization featured on the podcast, you can find us at gtzp.org on your preferred streaming or social media platforms. Find your cause with Greater Than 0%.